All right, it's 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the State Water Board Staff Workshop on potential legal delta and return flow water supply refinements to the water unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed. My name is Alyssa Osaluzo. I'm an environmental scientist in the State Water Board's Division of Water Rights, and I will be facilitating today's workshop. During the workshop, staff from the Division of Water Rights will describe and receive public input on potential changes to the water unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed for legal Delta water supplies. Staff will also describe evaluations that are being conducted to better understand return flows in order to inform possible modification to the methodology in the future. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some logistics. First, this workshop is being recorded and is being streamed via webcast on the Cal EPA website at video.calepa.ca.gov. A recording of this workshop will be posted on the Delta Drought webpage as soon as possible afterwards. Also, a copy of these presentation slides was posted this morning on the Delta Drought webpage, and you can find that at waterboards.ca.gov/drought/delta under the announcements section. If you're interested in having the slides as a reference during the staff presentation, please visit our website to follow along. In order to successfully manage today's workshop, we asked all speakers to submit a virtual speaker card in advance. If you have already submitted a virtual speaker card, you should be in the Zoom meeting using the link or meeting ID and password provided to you via email. If you have not submitted a virtual speaker card, or if you have submitted a virtual speaker card but have not received the Zoom information, please email us at bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. If you have not submitted a virtual speaker card but would like to make a comment today, please submit a virtual speaker card now using the online form that was provided in the workshop notice and also is linked on this slide. The notice can be found on our Delta Drought website as well under the announcements section. So today's workshop will consist of two parts. First, a staff presentation, and then the opportunity for comments and questions from the public and other agencies. Following the staff presentation, we'll hear one panel presentation from the public, then provide the opportunity for public comment by others who submitted a virtual speaker card. We currently have around 7 additional individuals who may speak today. And then we plan to take a short break between the staff presentation and the public comments and questions. And I'd like to remind all the speakers today that oral comments should address the topics identified in the workshop notice and the staff presentation. Staff will also be taking notes and may respond to any clarifying questions that you may have, so please include those during your opportunity to speak. If you'd like to provide written comments on the topics covered today, they can be emailed to bay-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. The comment period will close 2 weeks from today on Friday, March 24th at 5 p.m. That brings us to the end of the housekeeping matters. So as we go to the next slide, I'll turn it over to Abby to introduce the staff presentation.
Thanks very much, Alyssa. My name is Abby Warner, and I'm an environmental scientist in the Drought Planning, Hearings, and Special Projects section of the Division of Water Rights. Here's the agenda for the staff presentation today. I will cover the purpose of the workshop and background information about the water unavailability methodology for the Delta watershed, which we will be referring to simply as the methodology. Then I'll hand it off to Jesse Jankowski to discuss our first workshop topic, potential legal Delta water supply refinements to the methodology. Next, Lauren Adams will provide a presentation on progress toward understanding return flows better in order to inform possible future refinements to the methodology. After the staff presentation concludes, we will take public comments. Next slide, please. The methodology is a tool used under a drought emergency regulation adopted by the board to capture water supply and demand in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta watershed at both the watershed and subwatershed scales in order to determine when water is unavailable for diversion by water rights holders and claimants at their priorities of right. The methodology is used to support the issuance of curtailment orders to water rights holders and claimants pursuant to the emergency curtailment and reporting regulation that became effective in 2021 and was renewed in 2022. The board has received public comments contending that the current methodology does not properly account for the unique water supply conditions in the legal delta. Public comments have additionally been received regarding return flow estimation calculation methods. The purpose of this workshop is to provide a staff presentation and solicit public comment on both topics in advance of potential future methodology updates. Next slide, please. Here are the anticipated next steps for making possible refinements to the methodology regarding the topics that will be discussed in this workshop. Input received as presentations and oral comments during the workshop and in writing by the notice deadline of 5 p.m. on Friday, March 24th will be considered. Possible additional follow-up on specific issues may occur. Additional workshops may also occur for specific possible refinements to return flows in the future. Any adjustments to the methodology will be documented in revisions to the methodology report and appendices, possibly expected in late spring or early summer of this year. The State Water Board will evaluate whether readoption of the emergency regulation should occur this year. If it does occur, it is anticipated that it would happen in July of 2023. I will now turn the presentation over to Jesse to provide a summary of potential legal delta water supply refinements to the water unavailability methodology.
Thank you, Abby. Next slide, please. Good morning, and thanks to those tuning in. My name is Jesse Jankowski. I'm a Senior Water Resource Control Engineer Specialist in the Drought Planning, Hearings, and Special Projects section of the Division of Water Rights. And I'll be talking in depth about the proposed adjustments to the methodology to consider additional water supplies to be available within the legal delta for the purpose of water unavailability analyses and curtailments. Next slide, please. Currently, the methodology evaluates water unavailability in the legal delta by comparing the demands of water rights and claims within it to natural and abandoned supplies originating upstream. The supply needed to meet the demand of a given water right or claim in the legal delta is assumed to be distributed among any upstream tributaries which have supply available at its priority of right. A water right or claim in the legal delta is only curtailed when the unavailability analysis indicates that there is zero supply available at its priority of right from all tributaries that it has access to. These tributaries and their assumed connectivity within the watershed are shown in the flowchart on the right of this slide. Because the methodology does not currently determine correlative curtailments, riparian claims of right are only curtailed when there is zero total supply in all upstream tributaries. So in the legal delta, riparian users would therefore not be curtailed unless all streams in the delta watershed have run dry or are anticipated to. Water unavailability analyses require the selection of a time step over which water supply is compared to anticipated demands. Curtailment of rights or claims in the legal delta is only based on unavailability analyses over periods of at least 1 month due to transit times and other legal delta factors. Comments have been received from stakeholders since 2021 that the methodology's current approach does not account for unique water supply conditions within the legal delta. Comments have suggested that the board utilize hydrodynamic models, such as the Department of Water Resources Delta Simulation Model, DSM-2, to make curtailment decisions based on water quality or fingerprinting of water source origin at specific points of diversion. Other comments have suggested that additional abandoned flows, saline or brackish inflows from tidal action, or seepage from delta islands be considered as additional water supplies available to meet legal delta demands. These suggestions were either based on invalid assumptions or they were not feasible to implement within the scope of the emergency drought regulation in order to make water unavailability determinations based on water supply and demand analyses, which are consistent with the methods utilized for the rest of the watershed. Next slide, please. To address these comments in part, and to make updates to the existing methodology which can feasibly be implemented within the timeline of the emergency drought regulation, staff are proposing a methodology adjustment to provide for an additional supply of water which would be assumed to be available to all legal delta users in addition to natural and abandoned inflows to the delta. This additional delta supply represents the amount of fresh water that is present in the channels of the legal delta at the beginning of the dry season and would be available only to users diverting within the legal delta when the methodology indicates that there is water unavailability within the watershed. The water present in delta channels would be considered a supply source in addition to inflows to the delta from upstream tributaries, and it would be depleted throughout the dry season. The demands of rights and claims in the legal delta would be distributed among each upstream tributary and the delta channels in proportion to the supply available at their priority date from each. This reflects the physical reality that delta users are unable to determine the origin of the water that they divert from delta channels. The conservative assumption that the delta supply would not be the first source from which any legal delta demand would be met decreases the likelihood that the additional source of supply would be depleted within the first analysis time step. The delta supply would also not be considered the last source of water from which delta demands would be met, as this could cause curtailment of upstream water rights, even when senior legal delta users may have access to additional supplies. The volume of water in legal delta channels is proposed to be 893,919 acre-feet, which represents the total volume of water in legal delta channels below the mean sea level at San Francisco, which is 0.97 meters. This volume is analogous to the amount of water which would remain in delta channels and other currently flooded areas below mean tidal levels if all upstream inflows ceased and conditions stabilized. These channels and flooded areas, including some that could be dry at a water surface elevation of 0.97 meters, are shown in the figure on the right of this slide. This delta channel volume estimate was provided by the California Department of Water Resources Delta Modeling section and computed using bathymetry data currently used in the three-dimensional hydrodynamic and water quality Bay Delta schism model. These proposed delta supply modifications would not otherwise change the ways in which water unavailability is analyzed in the delta watershed. This proposed adjustment, as well as all previous versions of the methodology, were developed in coordination with the State Water Board's Office of the Delta Water Master. Any curtailments issued in the legal delta require the concurrence of the Delta Water Master. Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates conceptually how the delta supply would be operated within the context of the methodology throughout the water year. The graphs on the right show unavailability analyses for a hypothetical dry water year, with the blue lines representing the number of curtailments under the current analysis. The red lines represent the number of curtailments with the proposed delta channel supply adjustment, and the green line up top shows the proposed additional delta supply balance month to month. The top graph shows hypothetical curtailments in the entire delta watershed, and the bottom graph shows hypothetical curtailments in just the legal delta. These graphs don't have vertical axes because they're intended just to demonstrate the changes in the magnitude of curtailments month to month and between scenarios. Moving through the narrative on the left, in step 1, the delta channel volume would be made available as an additional water source to legal delta demands in the methodology. This would occur for the first analysis time step in the water year when the methodology indicates that water is unavailable to any rights or claims in the watershed scale analysis without the water in the channels. This is appropriate because even if the water right or claim facing unavailability is not located in the legal delta, this unavailability is due in part to the demands of senior riparian claims in the legal delta. Watershed scale unavailability begins in January in this example. After the first month's unavailability analysis, the delta supply may be depleted. If it is not, the remaining unused supply would be carried over as the starting supply volume for the next month's analysis in step 2. The delta channel volume would be depleted month to month, with larger draws on the supply occurring during months when natural inflows to the delta would be lower. In the months of June and July, in this conceptual example, the red lines dip noticeably below the blue lines in both graphs because there would be fewer curtailments in the legal delta and the entire watershed due to the availability of the delta channel volume. However, the remaining delta channel volume would be depleted during the month of July in this example. Step 3 shows that, as a result, the channel volume would not completely preclude legal delta curtailments later in the season. In this case, because the delta channel volume would be depleted in July and natural flow supplies remain low, legal delta curtailments would still be warranted in July and August under either scenario. Finally, in step 4, replenishment of the volume of supply from delta channels would only be considered when all curtailments in the legal delta have been suspended, in this example in the month of November. Because freshwater added to the delta supply balance must originate from the Sacramento or San Joaquin River watersheds, it would be inappropriate to credit the balance of water in these channels if curtailments are in place based on a lack of water supply from these sources. At this time, staff do not propose considering other additions to legal delta supplies. The methodology already accounts for upstream natural and abandoned freshwater inflows to the delta, and the proposed adjustments make the conservative assumption that the entire volume of water present in delta channels at the beginning of the period when water is unavailable in the watershed would be of adequate quality for beneficial use. Tidal inflows to the delta and the exchange of brackish water from Sassoon Bay are not assumed to represent freshwater supplies which could replenish the water present in delta channels, especially during times when the methodology indicates system-wide supply deficits to the point where legal delta curtailments would be warranted, even with the additional delta channel supply. Next slide, please. To compare the current approach to the proposed legal delta supply adjustment approach, the addition of the freshwater present in delta channels as an additional source of water specifically addresses comments received on the methodology, namely that the current approach does not account for freshwater supplies present in the channels of the legal delta. The proposed adjustment to the methodology would assume that an additional source of water is available that would result in fewer curtailments compared to the current approach, both in the legal delta and across the watershed, when there is a volume of delta supply remaining. This is particularly true in the spring and summer, when natural and abandoned flow supplies decrease, but direct diversion demands remain high. However, once the additional source of supply is depleted, the curtailment of rights and claims in the legal delta would be warranted when remaining freshwater supplies are insufficient to meet all demands in the watershed. These curtailments would be the same as those determined using the current version of the methodology. The depletion rate of the delta channel volume is greatly dependent on the monthly patterns of supply and demand in the watershed. Dry fall and early winter conditions would cause the initiation of the delta channel volume earlier in the year, with that earlier initial drawdown potentially resulting in depletion of the channel supply through the winter and spring, resulting in legal delta curtailments in the spring or summer. On the other hand, a wetter fall and winter would cause initial drawdown of the delta channel volume to begin later in the year, prolonging the availability of the supply into the summer and not warranting legal delta curtailments until later in the year. Next slide, please. This slide again conceptualizes the impact of these supply and demand patterns, this time over a hypothetical 4-year period of critical supply conditions. This multi-year analysis conservatively assumes that the delta supply would be completely replenished at the start of each new water year, which doesn't consider that in some cases water unavailability in the legal delta may extend from the summer through the fall as dry conditions remain. The top graph shows the entire delta watershed's supply and demand alongside the starting delta channel balance at the beginning of each month. Some of the total demands included here would be reduced prior to the watershed scale analysis if they can't be met by local supplies in the headwater scale analysis. The demand patterns are the same quality controlled 2018 demand data set each year and do not account for enhanced reporting of projected demand data that is used to make actual curtailment decisions. The bottom graph shows the number of hypothetical curtailments in the whole watershed and the legal delta. These two are plotted at different scales, so they can be shown on the same graph. And again, both graphs lack vertical axes since they're just intended to show the magnitude of changes between scenarios. The vertical dashed lines divide different water years, and the shaded gray areas highlight months when there is no watershed scale unavailability without the delta channel supply. In some cases, this means the delta channel volume would become available later in the water year, though in others it would occur in the middle of winter when natural flow supply is the highest. The top graph shows that in water years with a dry fall, there is often a large demand deficit and the initial volume of water present in delta channels would be larger than the entire natural flow supply of the delta watershed. In the first water year, the delta channel supply would slightly decrease curtailments in the watershed in October, and though it would last through the summer, there would be no legal delta curtailments warranted under either scenario. In the second year, which has the lowest winter natural flow supplies, the delta channel volume would decrease overall curtailments through the winter and not warrant legal delta curtailments in June compared to the current analysis. However, the supply would be depleted by July and hypothetical curtailments would be the same in either scenario for that month. The third consecutive critical year would see fewer watershed curtailments in the fall due to the delta supply, but due to earlier initiation, it would be depleted earlier by May, and hypothetical legal delta curtailments would be warranted through August. In the final water year, supply picks up substantially in the winter, resulting in a prolonged delta channel supply through July that would decrease overall curtailments, though legal delta curtailments would still be warranted in August in this example. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the addition of water supply present in delta channels to the methodology would be a conservative adjustment in favor of fewer curtailments across the delta watershed and the assumption of greater water availability to junior users. This proposed adjustment would assume that the water present within all channels of the delta at the beginning of the dry season would remain of adequate quality for beneficial uses throughout the course of the dry season without freshwater supplementation from other sources. In reality, as this supply is withdrawn and in the absence of natural inflows, abandoned flows, or State Water Project and Central Valley Project storage releases, delta channels would be refilled with brackish water from Sassoon Bay that would eventually degrade water quality. This could result in the quality of water in some delta channels degrading below levels required for beneficial uses even before the volume of delta channel freshwater present at the beginning of the dry period is fully depleted. The proposed adjustment to the methodology would serve to delay curtailments in the legal delta, But once the additional supply is depleted after an extended dry period, curtailments would be the same as those warranted by the methodology's current approach. Staff have scheduled or already held several focused technical meetings with stakeholders to discuss Delta supply topics, and we are open to additional feedback in this meeting and in follow-up discussions. Next slide, please. In addition to the Delta supply changes, there's another small adjustment to the methodology which staff are proposing that is unrelated to legal Delta channel supply or return flows that I'll briefly describe. Presently, one of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's water rights for New Melones Reservoir, application 19304, permit 16600, is assumed to have the most junior project priority designation due to its authorized points of rediversion at the Old River Intake and Jones Pumping Plant. The rights diversion points on the Stanislaus River are shown in the upper right map on this slide, and its rediversion points in the delta are shown in the lower left map. To reflect the fact that water diverted under this right is not exported out of the delta watershed, staff proposed to adjust A019304's assumed priority date in the methodology to its original application filing date of March 11th, 1960. Because the methodology currently assumes this water right has zero demand, this adjustment is not expected to have significant impacts on curtailments. And with that, we'll move to the next slide, and I'll turn the presentation over to my colleague, Lauren Adams, to discuss return flows. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. My name is Lauren Adams. I'm a water resource control engineer in the State Water Board's Division of Water Rights. Today, I'm presenting on return flows, how they are characterized in the water unavailability methodology, comments we have received on this return flow characterization, work we are doing in consideration of these comments, and ongoing staff quality control methodology refinements, as well as some potential future return flow modifications. Next slide, please. Currently, in the water unavailability methodology, demands are characterized by reported diversion information. Curtailment decisions are made based on expected supply and demand. For some diversions, some of the water that was diverted will return back to the stream after diversion or use. To account for these return flows, the current methodology scales back demands based on the ratio of return flows to the diversions made to meet surface water demands based on calcium-3 assumptions. Specifically, irrigation season demand assumptions from a recent calcium studies analog year of 1976 were used. Demand for diversion to storage is not scaled by the demand factor. Next slide, please. The State Water Resources Control Board received public comments from water right holders and claimants and their representatives that return flows modeled in the water unavailability tool may be overestimated, and also that they may be underestimated. Parties that asserted that return flows are underestimated, as well as parties that asserted return flows are overestimated, both requested that the timing and quantity of the estimated return flows be compared against observed data. Fingerprinting was requested to determine the source of water at certain locations. Reclamation also claimed the right to retain its return flows from deliveries to its in-basin contractors. Next slide, please. Measuring observed return flows has its own challenges. Return flow discharges are not generally required to be measured and reported in California. Measured discharges from wastewater effluent and irrigation runoff to drainage outlets in the Central Valley are neither widely available nor do they provide a comprehensive return flow characterization. Return flows often route into a stream through a complex diversity of diffuse and pointed localized sources from agriculture, municipal, industrial, and environmental landscapes. Use practices and stream flow gauges are also dynamically changing. Gauges come on and offline. Crop types, acres farmed, and irrigation practices change, including, for example, reductions in rice acreage irrigated in the Sacramento Valley. Conservation and irrigation efficiency also vary widely and can affect the amount of diverted and used water returning to a stream. On-site or other local recapture or return flows also can and does occur. Next slide, please. As discussed previously, return flows are distributed throughout the watershed and are poorly gauged in general. However, there are a limited number of locations in the watershed that have good gauge records and are likely to be dominated by return flows, with the caveat that these locations do not capture return flows exclusively, nor do they capture all return flows in their respective basins. Historical flows at locations dominated by discharge of irrigation return flows were compared with the modeling of calcium 3 return flows at these same locations for the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds. These gauges are the CDR, located in the Colusa Basin Drain near Highway 20, and BSL, Butte Slough New Meridian in the Sac Valley, and the MSG and SSH, located in Mud and Salt Sloughs, respectively, in the San Joaquin Valley. These gauges are downstream of some of the more significant discharges of irrigation outlets and are key sources of modeled return flows in calcium 3. For example, MSG said the Mud and Salt Slough return flows are about 15% of calcium 3's total San Joaquin watershed return flows. Substantial return flows also occur further downstream of these gauges too. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at the gauge flows at these locations. The plots on this slide are of historical records of flow at each of the gauge locations. Pink are non-drought years, green and blue are the last true drought, two droughts. 2014 to 15 is green, and blue is during the recent drought. The first thing to notice here is that there is variability in observed flows at these gauging stations. It is relevant, however, that they are lower during recent severe droughts than the rest of the record. Second is the timing and volume of the observations. Calcium 3 assumes a strong September peak in rice-dominated areas, like in the Sac Valley. In our last presentation on return flows, my State Water Board colleague Matt Holland showed how calcium's strong September peak was likely too concentrated. Notice here the Sac Valley earlier spring and August peaks, and that modeled return flow volumes are likely too high in extreme drought years in light of both historical data in these severe drought years and in years with low acreage farming. The San Joaquin gauges resemble the pattern of combined Mud and Salt Slough flows and calcium 3 for the years of record, peaking earlier in the season around April and May before receding throughout the summer and into the fall. Gauged flow volumes, however, differ from those modeled in calcium 3. In non-drought years, gauged summer flows exceed calcium 3 flows. But in drought years, gauged flow at Mud and Salt Sloughs are less than not just total flows at these locations in calcium 3, but the calcium 3 return flows at these locations too. June and July gauge flow in Mud and Salt Slough is about 14,000 acre feet in drought years, for example, less than calcium 3 return and total flows at these locations. Next slide, please. This figure shows the pattern and magnitudes of modeled calcium 3 return flows at Mud and Salt Sloughs, as well as the whole San Joaquin watershed, compared with gauged Mud and Salt Slough flows for the recent past, including the 2014 to 15 drought. Far left is calcium 3 San Joaquin return flows. Second and third from left are Mud and Salt Slough return flows in calcium 3. Next are calcium 3's Mud and Salt Slough stream flows from a recent calcium 3 study, and then gauged Mud and Salt Slough flows. The similarity between the pattern and gauged Salt Slough flows on the right and modeled calcium 3 total flows at Salt Slough is visible. The similarity in pattern of the monthly modeled return flows in calcium 3's San Joaquin watershed and Mud and Salt Slough, the first three boxes on the left, as well as calcium's total Mud Slough flow, is also clear. Note the bell-shaped calendar year curve with low winter flows in the tails that slowly ascends from January to July when it peaks before falling, sometimes more dramatically than others back to winter again. You can also see that the pattern of the return flows estimated in calcium 3 for the San Joaquin watershed and at Mud and Salt Sloughs is the inverse of the pattern observed with gauged Mud and Salt Sloughs and calcium 3 Salt Slough. Additionally, the volumes of return flows estimated in calcium 3 in these sloughs, let alone total flow, exceed gauged mud and salt slough flows in almost all months of drought years, 2014 to 15, even after salt sluice flows were adjusted by calcium 3's closure term for these months. In June and July 2014 and 15, calcium salt slough closure term reduced salt slough flow by 9 and 5,000 acre feet, respectively. You can also see that the difference between mud and salt sluice flow during drought and non-drought is more pronounced with gauges than with calcium 3. The analysis of these key discharge locations in the Sac and San Joaquin valleys indicate potential overestimation of return flows during drought. Further analysis could provide insight into characterization of the timing and volume of differences in return flow estimations in calcium 3 and calcium 3's application into the water unavailability methodology because of the implementation's dependence on the ratio of return flows and diversions. Specifically, further analysis of return flow characterizations and of return flows and other stream flow accretions observable with Delta watershed stream flow gauges during drought, not just at these and other key discharge locations, but potentially even more importantly, for the full geospatial area of the Delta watershed, including areas for which return flows are currently ungauged. Next slide, please. This next set of slides introduces the analysis underway to further analyze return flows in the Delta watershed. This addresses comments requesting comparison of observed return flows with the return flows modeled in the methodology tool, which are based on the ratio of calcium 3's estimated return flows to calcium 3's diversions to meet surface water demands during drought. Next slide, please. The return flow analysis presented here is based on accretions observable with active stream flow gauges. Accretions are local increases in stream flow. Return flows are a type of accretion. Calculating accretions observable at active gauging stations provides insight into return flow volumes from the diversity of return flow sources. Net accretions and depletions at each active gauging station are being calculated as the difference between the flow observed at each active gauging station and all its nearest active upstream gauges for all the gauges in the Delta watershed for the past 20 years. So in the figure in this slide, for example, with the yellowy orange gauges, if flow at gauging station Q at stream flow gauge G in the slide in the middle was 100 CFS and flow at its upstream gauging station U at the top of that watershed in the figure was 20 CFS, then the accretion between those gauging stations, which is indicated at the downstream station G, is 80 CFS. For this analysis, net accretions and depletions are calculated at each active gauge in the Delta. Next slide, please. Return flows, as the figure in this slide indicates, are just one type of factor that affects stream flow losses or depletions or stream flow gains, in other words, accretions. Some reaches within gauging stations in a watershed have a net stream flow gain, whereas others have a net stream flow loss. Diversions remove water from the stream between gauging stations, whereas storage withdrawals, surface and subsurface flows, groundwater discharges, and return flows add water between stations. The net accretions and depletions, the A/D term in the equations, are calculated at each active gauging station. Next slide, please. This method was developed to capture an estimate of the diversity of return flows present in a watershed. As you can see on the right, return flows can come from a variety of land use types: farms, cities, towns, industries, wetlands. Return flows also can have been sourced from water that was diverted and used from storage withdrawal, precipitation already routed to the stream that was measured at upstream gauge U before it hit the middle gauge G, or precipitation just routed to the stream after flowing overland through soil or infiltrating into groundwater between gauges G and its upstream gauge U, as well as rediversion of return flows that were non-consumptively or consumptively used earlier in time. Please keep in mind that accounting for big system processes like diversions and storage withdrawals can isolate return flows, but this is just an initial step in a process of identifying return flows. Identifying the source of return flows would require multiple additional steps. Future methods could consider the task of sourcing return flows at this level of detail, But this first cut approach focuses on getting an estimate of total return flows before refining that estimate to identify the source of these return flows. Next source, please. Next slide, please. Best available information measured or reported for the other factors that result in stream flow increases or decreases between gauging stations, but are not return flows, are being compiled by gauging station to isolate return flows from other accretions. So, for example, accretions that could be attributed to storage withdrawals are excluded from the tally for watershed accretions. They cause localized increases in stream flow, not because they are return flows, but because they are storage withdrawal. Similarly, if there's a net accretion between two gauges and a diversion between them, that means that the return flows and other factors that increase stream flow must have occurred in large enough volumes to account for the diversion and to result in a net stream gain. So reported diversions were added to the right-hand side of the equation. With this approach, an estimation of return flow is calculated for each gauging station G based on the activity occurring between that gauging station and its upstream gauging stations U. The accretions depletions at each gauge G are measured, and from that, for the stretch of river between that gauge G and upstream gauge U, the storage withdrawals, accretions that can be attributed to ungauged upper watershed tributary flows, return flows from diversions reported for non-consumptive use are subtracted, and accretions lost to locally reported diversions are added. These return flow estimates are a rough estimate. In the wet season and when there are storms, they likely overestimate return flows because they include overland flow, inflow, and groundwater discharge that just routed to a particular reach of a stream and transfers. This is visible in the wet season when return flows are known to be low and there are still accretions in the system. There could also be underestimations from unreported diversions that diverted return flows and groundwater losses. Errors from gauged error and groundwater actions can also be present. Next slide, please. With this approach, net accretions and a rough estimation of accretions that could be attributed to return flows are calculated for each active delta gauging station for the past 20 years at 15-minute hourly, daily, and monthly night time scales as needed. Reported diversions are attributed to the nearest upstream gauge. Accretions are calculated dynamically using the nearest active gauge. So, for example, if in this watershed gauge G was inactive, the gauge in the middle of the watershed, say because it's 2007 and the gauge hasn't actually come online yet, then accretions and depletions are not calculated between that gauge G and its upstream gauge U. Instead, next slide, please. The calculation adjusts. So it's calculating accretions between the next nearest active gauge, the two nearest active gauges, including the activity that occurs between these gauges. Ultimately, each subwatershed has its own unique return flow volumes by reach between gauging stations and for the subwatershed as a whole. Reach and month-specific accretions could provide insight for future return flow refinements in the methodology. Next slide, please. A fingerprinting analysis was conducted to trace net accretions, so here are just the accretions between two active gauging stations, to San Joaquin River stream flow as it flowed downstream last summer between June and September of 2022 during the drought. The sum of June to September flow in 1,000 acre-feet is on the y-axis. The x-axis is the San Joaquin River mile, with some of the active gauging stations and confluence locations identified along the way. Moving left to right is the flow of the river from Friant to Vernalis as it makes its way to the bay. The blue is the measured stream flow. The red is measured net accretions between gauging stations. The yellow is the fingerprinting of these net accretions as they move downstream. Yellow fingerprinting traces include net accretions between valley rim dams from tributaries. To provide an example of a net accretion, here the red line. If a flow measured at Skaggs Bridge below gauge SKB below Friant Dam was, for example, 120 CFS, and its nearest upstream gauge, in this case Donnie Bridge DNB, was measuring 100 CFS, then the net red accretions at Skaggs Bridge would be 20 CFS. The yellow line is the fingerprinting of the net accretions. It assumes that if stream flow at a gauge exceeds the net accretion measured at the nearest upstream gauge, then that upstream gauge's net accretions persists or is fingerprinted onto that gauge. So if there is at least 20 CFS of flow at Gravelly Ford, the nearest gauge below Skaggs Bridge, then it is assumed that the 20 CFS of net accretion observed at Skaggs Bridge continues to flow downstream to Gravelly Ford. Then Gravelly Ford's net accretions are added to that 20 CFS to produce the yellow fingerprinted volume of fingerprinted net accretion at Gravelly Ford. This process of aggregating observed accretions then continues downstream. Even with this conservative assumption that return flows and other accretions are depleted from the stream after all other water sources, fingerprinting identified that last summer, return flows and other accretions were depleted from the San Joaquin River as they traveled downstream. In the San Joaquin watershed, for example, all of the return flows and other flows above Mays Bridge were depleted between June and September. This is known because of the San Joaquin River at Mays Bridge went dry right above the mouth of the Stanislaus River, went dry between June and September of last year. No water, including water from return flows, persisted from the San Joaquin watershed above Mays Bridge to below Mays Bridge. Although return flows may be locally available at a gauging station, they may not be available further downstream. This seems particularly true in drought. Fingerprinting provides insight into the availability of return flows and other accretions at any specific time and place, but a real-time curtailment model would be needed to incorporate fingerprinting and this level of detail into curtailment decisions. However, given the observed losses to return flows, it could be that a loss factor developed from the historical time series could provide benefits. Next slide, please. In summary, several potential modifications to return flow assumptions could be possible, including future refinements informed by observation of return flows and other accretions at a subwatershed or reach scale with the method described here, considering characterizations of return flows in calcium-3 and other modeling platforms could also be made. These future estimates could also include gauge error, groundwater interactions, and transfers. Loss factors derived from fingerprinting of net accretions during drought could further refine expected availability of return flow estimations for the methodology, as could enhanced monitoring of return flows in key irrigation discharge locations with consistently large accretions or occasional very large accretions, and or reporting of return flows by the largest diverters. Further refinements could include adjustments for return flows from diversions for non-consumptive use that do not return to the stream at the same time and place at which they were diverted, as well as continued QA/QC of diversion data. A shift to more sophisticated modeling tools, such as with a real-time curtailment tool that could incorporate measurements, forecasting, and fingerprinting of accretions and other return flows into real-time curtailment decisions, is also possible. Input on these options or other modeling tools and analyses is invited, including input on how to account for Reclamation's claim that it returns the right to return flows resulting from deliveries to its in-basin contractors. This concludes the staff presentation. I will now turn it back over to Alyssa. Thank you for attending this workshop. We look forward to hearing any feedback. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Lauren. Before we move on to public comments, we're going to take a short break. Let's be back at 11 o'clock. All right, it's 11 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started with our public comments for today. Can we go to the next slide, please? So if you have any clarifying questions, please include them during your speaking time, and staff will do their best to respond immediately before we move on to the next speaker. Next slide, please. This slide indicates our current list of speakers based on who submitted a virtual speaker card. We'll begin with John Herrick and Dean Ruiz, though I don't see Dean in the Zoom meeting with us. So John, when you are ready, go ahead and unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. John Herrick, South Delta Water Agency. I noticed at the end of Jesse's presentation, the last thing said that there had been focused meetings with stakeholders to discuss these issues. But I've asked a number of times, including each one of these workshops and through email, to meet with staff to go over these things. And Jesse, you can confirm that you said there are topics you can't talk about. In other words, the legal requirements for some of these things. And you said it was always better to meet after we've had the workshop to address these things. And so I'm hereby respectfully but firmly requesting that within an hour of this being done, that somebody at the state board send me a few dates for possible meetings so the Delta people can actually meet with the state board to go over these things, because up to now, the state board has declined to meet with Delta reps on these issues. The new calculation for water availability in the Delta treats the Delta itself as a reservoir. I'd like some clarification eventually as to where they drew the line for that 890,000 acre feet being in the pool, but that's not overly important at this moment. Now, of course, the Delta is not an isolated reservoir that doesn't have inflow to it, and it's always full. We know that. It's clear on its face, and I don't know why we have to keep covering the same ground. The issue is quality, of course, and that is, will the waters of the Delta slowly degrade in drought times if the projects do not abide by their legal obligations? Now, the projects are indeed obligated to maintain water quality in the Delta. That's in their permits, it's in statutes, and it's in the case law pertaining to the operation of the Delta. The projects also currently release water for in Delta use. Now, nobody talks about that, but when you calculate Delta outflow, the calculation is inflow, diversions, and loss, and what's left is outflow. So if you don't include in Delta consumptive use or other losses such as evapotranspiration, if you don't include those, then you'd never come up with an accurate outflow, but we do come up with semi-accurate outflows, and that's because the projects specifically release water to cover in Delta uses. So I hope that the DWR staff is not proposing that during drought times or approaching drought times that the project should stop operating as they currently do to provide for in Delta use. Now, another inconsistency here is the last time we had this methodology, the staff was very firm that horrible quality water from the west when it comes into the Delta can't be used by Delta diverters because it's not of a good enough quality. Now, first of all, that's not true in that the water is freshened as it comes in. Some of that water was recently pushed out of the Delta, so it was Delta water, it's not ocean water. And it's up to the individual diverter to decide whether or not he's going to divert water as it slowly gets worse. But under the new scenario, with this reservoir description of the Delta, when that reservoir is gone, what's left in the Delta? Because there's only inflow that's being released by the reservoirs, and there's only exports. And so the rest of the water must be all that salty water that came in from the west. And if that salty water is not available for export or for use by local diverters because it's of poor quality, it's certainly not available for exports to areas that have a lower priority. Again, the issue of the intruding salt water from the west still hasn't been addressed, and that supply is always available, and it's freshened as it comes into the Delta, and it's supposed to be freshened. And of course, we've been quoting the Butte Canal case for years and years and years. When somebody else freshens your supply, that's our supply, they can't complain that you can use the water that's there because they freshened it. Now, again, let me return to that issue of when the reservoir that you've made up is out of water, what water's in the Delta then? Is it export water? Is it old water from the west? Is it somebody's return flows? You're saying that 890,000 acre feet of water has filled the delta, but it's not anybody's water and can't be used. So anyway, that part is, I still think, ignoring reality. It ignores the operative permits, statutes, and laws. And I look forward to a meeting with staff on how that works when they schedule the meeting after this methodology workshop. Now, the groundwater issue is very complicated. I'll have to admit that as we went through all those charts, some of them not labeled as to what the colored dots meant, I couldn't follow it. So it seems very complicated. I know it is complicated. I don't think we should assume that the calculations are very accurate, and they need some outside review to make sure we can get some additional input on how we might address those things. What we do know is that the entire valley is sloped down to the delta. And so there's constant groundwater movement from all over, including San Joaquin County down into the delta, including everybody around us down towards the delta. If you interview some well drillers, excuse me, you'll find out that they all agree there's a slope subsurface, and that water flows down into the delta and becomes part of the supply in the delta. If you'd like to come out and talk to the people who divert from our delta channels, they can tell you that they can see water that comes in, it's bubbling up, and it's feeding those channels. So that water is not being calculated as return flows into the delta, and we know that it's happening. Now, we don't know how much it is, and I don't know how easy or if that's practically speaking possible to calculate, but we know that it is coming in. And of course, in the South Delta, during many times, especially drought times, there's no net flow out of the area. So if there's no net flow out of the area, then gauges that you may be looking at, I don't think you're looking at in delta gauges, but delta gauges wouldn't pick up any increased supply because the volume of water in there is managed or controlled by the tides. And so there's always a certain volume, so you couldn't pick up the additional increase that comes in from those groundwater accretions. I'm almost done here. I apologize for rambling on. I'd also like to note that the current policy of the state board that allows transfers during drought times, that the transferor gets to substitute the water with groundwater, then of course adversely affects all of those downstream water users, because it interrupts or changes the accretions to rivers. It interrupts and alters the return flows that may be happening. And I'll just add, although it has nothing to do with the methodology, it's a singularly counterproductive policy to allow transfers during drought times so that you double the water use from that watershed during those drought years. So when the watersheds upstream of the delta are running out of water and you're allowing them to export some of that water and they use their groundwater, you've doubled the use and it further exacerbated the drought we're going through. I guess that's about it. And again, I'd like to stress right now, and I hope I'm not being overly nasty, but I hope that Jesse sends me an email within an hour of this and tries to schedule a meeting, because they have declined to do so in the past. And I want to make sure everybody understands that. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Dean is not going to comment. He is just listening. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And my sincere apologies that we didn't get to you in preparing for this workshop, but you are absolutely correct. We said we'd like to meet after the materials related to this workshop have been released publicly. Now that they are, I will certainly be reaching out to you, and we look forward to a meeting to discuss this further. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. Let's move on to Gary Zhao.
Hi, yes. I just have a very simple question. So it seems that when you improve your analysis method, I think right now you have the analysis at least 1 month, like a monthly time step. So do you have plan to improve on that? Maybe have a smaller time step?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Gary, for the purpose of unavailability in the legal delta, curtailment decisions are only made with a monthly time step. However, for the purpose of suspending curtailments, we may and have used time steps shorter than that, as well as for imposing curtailments elsewhere in the watershed outside of the legal delta. We have in the past used as short as a 7-day time step in order to better account for anticipated precipitation and runoff in the near term.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you, Gary. By request, we're going to shift the public speakers list on the slide around a little bit, and we'll go to Susan Paulson next for our comments. When you're ready, you may unmute yourself and begin.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I think I have questions more than comments because you know, we've spent some time reviewing the document and just have more questions, I think, than we do comments at this point. I guess the first question would be whether the project exports from the Delta would be counted against that Delta pool.
The current proposal, Susan, is that yes, any diversions of natural flow by the projects or any other legal Delta users would be counted against the Delta channel supply.
Okay. Okay. How would the proposed method work if there is a shortage in a really small upstream watershed? You know, what if the volume of that shortage is much smaller than the volume of water that's in the Delta pool? Do you still count all Delta diversions against the full Delta pool?
So it is not, again, the current proposal, we're certainly open to feedback on this. The proposal is a binary. If there is any unavailability on the watershed scale, then that Delta supply would be initiated. It is not volume or location dependent. As I said, the reasoning for that being that unavailability at the watershed scale is caused in part by the senior demands of riparian claimants in the legal delta. So that's the thinking behind a trigger point for initiating that Delta supply would be when there is unavailability at the watershed scale.
So the Delta pool concept is, like you said, it's binary. You're either on or you're off. It wouldn't matter if, like, for example, if there's a shortage in some of the watershed, but you still have abundant natural flow coming in, Delta diverters would not be, their diversions wouldn't be counted against the natural flow or wouldn't take account for the natural flow that is still coming in. Their diversions would be solely from that Delta pool?
No. So I mentioned on one of the slides that the Delta channel supply would be considered, when it is considered to be available, would be considered alongside all of the upstream tributaries. So it's considered in the same manner, and the supply needed to meet a given demand in the legal delta would be distributed among all of the upstream tributaries and the delta supply in proportion to the magnitude of each of those. And just to reiterate, if there's a local shortage on a headwater stream because there's not enough local supply to supply all local demands, that would not trigger the initiation of this delta channel supply. That would only be triggered by unavailability on the whole watershed scale, that there's not enough water overall to meet all demands in the watershed.
I think that may be a devil in the details. And so I guess that leads to the next question that I would have, which is whether you've done a test drive of how this proposed method would work using data over the last, say, 4 or 5 years. And could you please share that?
I know we have a specific meeting scheduled with some folks on your team to discuss details. I think that might be a better venue to talk about specific data. As I showed in the presentation, that's a hypothetical kind of multi-year critical dry year scenario that I think helps demonstrate some of these concepts. But yeah, we can certainly talk more outside of this forum about specific information. We have analyzed this for recent times.
Okay, that would be really helpful. So in terms of how this would work, again, I'm sort of focused on the logistics. If you had a projected shortage for a given month, like let's say you'd been depleting the Delta pool because people were diverting and there was watershed or water unavailability elsewhere. Let's say you had 300,000 acre feet left in your Delta pool, but based on historical practices, you anticipated that there would be 450,000 acre feet of diversions over the coming month. How and when would you decide who would be curtailed?
So the curtailments are still based on the current methodologies approach. So if the Delta channel supply is available to legal Delta diverters, their demands are apportioned out to the available supplies. If at a given priority date anywhere in the watershed, there is zero supply available to meet a given demand, then that water right would still be curtailed. So as you could see in the scenarios I showed, the presence of the Delta supply does not preclude any curtailments in the watershed because there could still be zero supply available to a given water right by priority. However,
upstream,
yes, upstream outside of the legal Delta.
Okay.
The curtailment of a legal Delta right or claim would only occur when there is zero supply in that Delta channel volume, because curtailment requires zero supply available from all sources. So it would be pretty extreme conditions where there is zero Delta channel supply remaining in the year, and there's also zero natural flow available at a given priority date in the legal Delta.
Okay. So maybe in understanding how this works, I'm trying to think of like hypotheticals to understand it. If we had a whole series of storms and a super wet winter in the Sacramento River watershed, but for whatever reason, there was no rain and no storms and no snow in the San Joaquin, and so we had curtailments and shortages in the San Joaquin, but abundant flow in the Sacramento, how would it work?
Yeah, so in that situation, there could still be San Joaquin watershed scale curtailments, which could still cause that initiation of the Delta channel supply, earlier in the water year, because those watershed scale curtailments in either watershed are based on the legal Delta. That being said, with higher supplies, say in one of the watersheds, I would expect that it certainly makes legal Delta curtailments less likely because there's still higher natural flow supply. Obviously, there would be more likely San Joaquin watershed scale curtailments outside of the legal Delta because of that drier natural flow. But because of that higher Sacramento watershed supply, that's more likely to prolong the availability of that Delta channel supply later in the year.
But as I understand it, it wouldn't be used to replenish or augment that Delta supply amount. Is that correct?
As I've said before, we're open to feedback on these ideas. The current proposal is that we would not consider replenishment of that Delta channel supply until legal Delta curtailments were no longer warranted, essentially at the end of the season. The thinking behind that being that would be the case in which there would be unappropriated supply in the watershed.
Okay. Would this operate on a monthly time step, the evaluation?
Yes. So, of course, we only operate on a monthly time step for the purpose of legal Delta curtailments. Typically, we're running these curtailment analyses every week of a given month, but it's always for the same analysis period. So week to week, we're still looking at March 1st through 31st as the analysis period. Each of those analyses would use the same starting Delta channel supply volume because it's still the same discrete monthly time step. However, moving to the next month, April, we would then use the remaining supply volume from the last March analysis and consider that volume of Delta channel supply as the starting volume of Delta channel supply for April. I hope that makes sense.
I think so. And so curtailments would still happen within the Delta on a priority basis. You'd consider priority date in deciding how much water and who needed to be curtailed?
Yeah, and so again, those legal Delta curtailments would only occur either if the Delta channel supply was depleted during that month or if the starting Delta channel supply was zero. But yes, legal Delta curtailments could still be warranted on a priority basis. And that would be, essentially in a later month in those examples I showed in August or September, with a zero starting Delta channel volume, that would be the same as the outputs of the current methodology, because it's saying the only supply available to meet those legal Delta demands is the upstream natural flow. The Delta channel volume has been depleted. So those curtailments would be the same for the legal Delta as warranted by the current methodology.
Where do the projects fall into the priority curtailment system?
So under area of origin protections, any project rights which export water outside of the watershed. So these are all the project rights named in D1641, with the exception of Friant and New Melones. All of those project rights are treated as the most junior in the watershed. There are some provisions to acknowledge the coordinated operations agreement, wherein those project rights are only curtailed if all of them would be curtailed, if all of them have water available. If there are curtailments in the legal Delta, that would mean that all of those project rights are curtailed.
Okay. Okay. So in the prior versions of the methodology, there was Appendix D that discussed, new residence times and natural flows and project flows and things like that. Does that go away, or is that still part of the methodology?
I think we've yet to determine the exact impacts on our technical documentation. At this point, we're kind of just proposing conceptual approaches for moving forward.
Okay. And then how would you track natural flows or native flows?
So the natural flows and abandoned flows would be the same as the current methodology approach. And I should have said around that report, none of these changes would be implemented for the purpose of curtailments until a public methodology report and appendices were issued. So none of this would be done.
Coherent package.
Exactly. This
Okay.
staff workshop is just an initial step. We would have to issue those new reports in order to implement these for curtailments.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess, so maybe this, I may have sort of asked this already, but how would the addition of Delta supply into the methodology affect the curtailment of the junior project rights?
The addition of the Delta channel supply only results in fewer curtailments across the watershed when that supply is available. So it would make, when there is Delta channel supply available, it would make curtailment of those junior project rights less likely, as well as all other rights in the watershed, legal Delta or otherwise.
Okay. And then this may be something we can discuss next week, but we'd like just to sort of check the work on how the volume was calculated. We'd like to understand where that came from.
Absolutely. And I think John touched on this to reiterate. This is using bathymetry data for Delta channels that is used by the Department of Water Resources for its three-dimensional schism model. And the volume is the channels and flooded areas, the volume of those below 0.97 meters, which is mean sea level at San Francisco. Happy to talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, no, we just like to review the calculation. There's a difference in the volume. It's apples and oranges, but Appendix D lists a volume of 1.343 thousand acre feet, if I remember right, or 1.343 million acre feet. So it's a very different volume, but I think that's because the area is a little bit larger in the Appendix D calculation than in this one. So we just really want to understand the numbers and get our heads around that. And then I think maybe this is a comment more than a question, but something we can deal with. with the 4-page written description of this that came out, it's really hard to parse and follow and understand how this would work. And so, our concern would be that without clarification, if this is adopted, we're not sure we understand the rules and how they would be implemented. And it feels like they could be changed very readily. And of course, we're all looking for certainty. So we would hope for some test drive spreadsheets that we could really spend some time with ourselves and review and think about. And, some clarity around the language of how it's all written up. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, and we look forward to further working with you and increased documentation on this. This is a starting step. We did provide a version of the spreadsheet that includes this delta supply, but I know it is complicated to kind of determine how that would shake out in any given scenario. So thank you, Susan. Really appreciate your comments and look forward to further work.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you both. We'll move on to Greg Young. Do you have any questions or comments today?
Yeah, a couple of additional ones. So appreciate, again, the time and effort for staff to walk through a lot of this. There were tremendous amount of detail presented in when you're walking through the slides. So hopefully we'll get a chance to review all of that information again further, not just what was on the slide, but what was said about the slides. Kind of a follow-up that carries forward from where Susan just left off, and Jesse, your answer to that last one. Did you guys take the current spreadsheet that was supplied, the most recent representation with the delta channel quantity in it, and run it with a delta number in there? It's got a 0 in there right now. Did you guys run it with a value in there and see what happened?
Yeah, and apologies for the confusion, Greg. The reason that the spreadsheet supplied had a 0 is that right now there are no curtailments and there are no watershed curtailments supported by the methodology. But I do understand that seems contrary to us saying that this delta channel volume has a given supply. Yeah, the example shown in this presentation did include a non-zero supply when it's warranted, and we can certainly talk in more detail next week. The current spreadsheet has a cell that flags when there is watershed scale unavailability. So what one actually has to do is essentially run it without the delta channel supply. If there is watershed scale unavailability, that's when it would be appropriate to initiate that delta channel supply and go from there. So the examples I showed in here, yes, were non-zero. The reasoning behind the public spreadsheet having 0 is that right now in March, there is not, and there has not been watershed scale unavailability. We haven't had curtailments since December.
Understood, Jesse. I appreciate that point. I think the question is, if you change it in that current spreadsheet from 0 to like the 890,000, we'd like to understand how the methodology is working through the spreadsheet, because a very simple look at that, and there's a lot in that spreadsheet. So we'll be the first to admit there's a lot to unpack. But it seemed that water was depleted out of that pool when you run it for March, which doesn't seem to track with what we would expect. So we want to understand how that plays through and how that's functioning. So appreciate it.
If you enter in a number, it will do something. I can promise that. So look forward to talking more.
Yeah, we'll figure out how that might work. So appreciate that, and do look forward to learning more about that. I want to jump to a couple of questions on the return side. I think Susan asked a lot of the questions on the other part. So on the return flow questions, I think it was mentioned a few times about excluding storage withdrawals from the calculation. Can you give a little bit more explanation to why those are being excluded, or are we misunderstanding what you mean by excluded from return flows?
Hi, sure. So the calculation was of net accretions in the stream. And so in order to identify which of those accretions were coming from return flows, we needed to exclude which were coming from storage withdrawals, because right below the dam, for example, they're just letting out a bunch of storage. They're withdrawing storage. It's not a return flow coming from a land use pattern at that moment. That could have been captured in another part of the stream.
Okay, because I know in past comments, we've noted that Reclamation has made a statement about maintaining their control and their return flows. I think we've asked questions about that rediversion of previously stored water and how it is showing up. So I just want to make sure we understand that. Maybe you can help us walk through some examples about that later when we get together.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify quickly that there's a difference between the removal of storage withdrawals and a calculation of a stream flow gain that's different than if the storage was diverted and used. So if a storage withdrawal was diverted and used, and then that after it was rediverted and used, it was returned to the stream, that's a different type of that would be a return flow. That wouldn't be that's different than storage withdrawal that I was referring to.
I appreciate that clarification.
I look forward to talking more later.
Yeah. And one question that, because there is one additional question, there is have been made statements about Reclamation controlling its return flows. How has board staff thought about it would separate those out and try and track those any different than any other return flows?
I think that we're open to suggestion at this point and are still thinking about it.
Okay.
If you have any ideas, go for it.
The one final question is, you had given some great examples of the mud and salt slough situation, compared calcium 3 representations versus actual gauge data. Did you do anything similar on any of the east side streams to kind of look at what they're showing? And do you have plans to do that on like Tuolumne or Stanislaus or something to understand how they may be showing up in calcium versus reality of gauge data on the ground?
That has not been done yet.
Okay. That's all I had right now. Again, appreciate you guys' time and efforts on this. These are complex challenges, and so we appreciate the opportunity to continue to work together.
Thank you for the comments.
Great, thank you both. So moving down our speakers list, David Wong has indicated he doesn't have any questions or comments at this time. And then Jeannie Zalezi and Matthew Emmerich do not appear to be in the Zoom meeting with us. So if you happen to be watching the webcast instead, or would still like to make a comment, please join the Zoom meeting with us, and we'll circle back around to you. So I think that brings us to potentially our last speaker, which is Brett Baker.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Fortunately for all of us, John Herrick went over most of what I was planning on talking about, including transfers. So thank you, John. And I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time here, but some of this stuff apparently bears repeating. The model, our issues with the model are such that it ignores the practical reality of the delta and the hydrology therein. There's always water in the delta. I think you referred to that as a unique water supply. So what we are talking about ultimately is quality, and of the many duties of the board, supply is one of many. And so the surface flows are just the tip of the iceberg. We want to remind folks that the intertide groundwater relations are important, and I think greatly glossed over and overlooked here. Just some examples. And John mentioned these. The exchange contractors, when their supply is met to and deficient in the accounting there, we should be correlative riparian users should be credited with whatever amount was taken out there. Additionally, we have transfers that go unaccounted for, and their impacts. Groundwater transfers, I'm talking about specifically, artesian flows and accretions. So I think, when you talk about 893,000 acre feet or 899 or whatever it is, 1,000 acre feet, you're missing in great deal. What is the quality of that? That really is our issue here. To our understanding, there is no level of water quality that is prevented for being put to beneficial use statutorily or otherwise. So we just and in addition to that, that Butte Canal case and the commingling of that supply and our unique location in hydrology, say it again, bear some they need to be represented in a fashion not done here. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you very much for your time. And this is a step in the right direction, I guess, but still way off path. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. So that brings us to the end of those who have submitted virtual speaker cards. I'd like to give the opportunity for any last comments or questions. So if you do have any, please feel free to raise your hand at this point. All right, not seeing any. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
There, I'm looking for the mute button. I guess I have one more follow-up question because I'm still a little bit confused about when a diversion from the Delta would count against the Delta pool versus when and how it would be counted against native water that might be flowing into the Delta. We had the impression from reading the document that you switched entirely to drawing from the Delta pool, but I think in the questions and answers that wasn't true. So just would ask for clarification on that point. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Paulson. So again, there is a point at which the Delta channel supply would be considered to be available. And actually, I'm wondering if we could go back to, I believe it might be slide 10 with the two graphs. Max, do you think we could go back to slide 10? Thank you, and sorry for the shuffling around. Let's actually go one more ahead. It was slide 11, thank you. So there is a point at which, and if we look in the third year here as an example, or let's look at the second year. So the second water year shown in this graph, there's a point at which the Delta supply is initiated, and that is in the month of November. In the month of October, there is no watershed scale unavailability, and so that column is grayed out. But in November, there is watershed scale unavailability, and that's where the green line in the top graph, that's the Delta supply bumps up because that Delta supply is considered to be made available to the legal Delta diverters. And the logic behind that is there is watershed scale unavailability even without that supply. So making that available would decrease curtailments and decrease unavailability across the watershed. And this second year is a good example because you can see in December that the blue line is supply, the black line is demand. You can see the blue line actually kind of bumps up a little bit later, February, March, April. So that blue line, which is the natural and abandoned flow supply of the watershed, is bumping up. And as a result, that is causing kind of slower depletion of that Delta channel supply volume as we move along in the year. And this is probably present even more so in the fourth year, even though that delta channel supply is initiated in October, because there is watershed scale unavailability. When there's that very, very high peak winter natural flow supply, it prolongs, it flattens out that curve of the delta channel supply later into the spring and summer. And that is because for a given demand in the legal delta, it is assumed to have access to, as I said, all of those natural flows of all of the upstream tributaries and abandoned flows alongside the delta channel supply in proportion to their magnitude. So where the magnitude in the fourth year of the natural flow supply is very high, that's going to, for a given demand in the legal delta, charge less of its demand against that delta channel supply because it's so much smaller than all of the upstream tributaries. It's going to charge more of that demand against the natural flow supplies. On the other hand, when we have areas where that green line is above the blue line, meaning that the delta channel supply is actually greater than all of the natural flow tributaries, those times the slope to the next month is steeper, which is because the charge of legal delta demands is greater on that delta channel supply because its magnitude is greater than the natural flow. So I said in a previous slide, but the delta channel supply is not the first source at which legal delta demands would take their supply from. That would result in very rapid depletion of the delta channel supply right away. And on the other hand, it's not the last source. Legal delta demands would not take from the delta channel supply as a last resort, only when there's zero supply available from all upstream tributaries, because that would actually cause curtailment of upstream water rights outside of the legal delta to be curtailed, even when there could be that additional delta channel supply available to those users. So accordingly, this delta channel supply, the green line, is considered an additional source of water alongside all of the upstream tributaries in the watershed, the blue line in the top graph.
So for a given time, how do you determine whether a given diversion is taking natural or pool supply?
There are 21 sources of supply, so that's each of the upstream tributaries, and then the delta channel supply is a 21st. And for a given demand in the legal delta, it is prorated among all of those sources. So the magnitude of that single demand is prorated among all those sources based on the supply that's available from each. If a given upstream tributary to the delta has zero supply available, it's going to instead redistribute that demand among the tributaries that do have supply available at its priority. So this is a per water right calculation for each given demand in the legal delta. It is prorated among the supplies available at its priority of right. And a small wrinkle to that has been documented, that has always been a part of the methodology, is that claims of only riparian rights are only distributed among tributaries upstream in the watershed where they're located. That's in accordance with State Water Board Order 89-8, whereas all claims of riparian or pre-14 rights, all pre-14 claims and all post-14 appropriative rights in the legal delta, those are distributed among all of the upstream tributaries in the Sacramento and San Joaquin watersheds. But no matter what, any given right or claim, if it's in the legal delta, is distributed in part to the delta channel supply.
Okay. And so in year 4 here, we've got a few months where the blue is way, way, way above the black. So the total supply is greater than the total demand, but it looks like the green line still goes down a little bit, even though it's a smaller rate. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And why is that?
Because that delta channel supply is still considered one of those available sources of water, because it was initiated previously in October at the start of that fourth year. So it is considered until its depletion as an available source to legal delta diverters.
But wouldn't a huge inflow in the delta help actually replenish that by flushing out lower quality water?
Yes.
I appreciate the feedback. We will consider that as part of these nuances of operations of the Delta channel supply.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Paulson, for your very thoughtful comments.
All right, so we have received one additional speaker card within the last few minutes. So we'll go ahead and go to Justin Fredrickson. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and begin whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you hear me?
You are a little faint.
Okay, I'll try and get a little closer. Justin Fredrickson, Water and Environmental Policy Analyst at the California Farm Bureau, and I'm just watching this and trying to, very technical, obviously, not an engineer. So and a lot of information there, as several speakers have mentioned. I just wanted to, I think some of the comments that have been made, I would agree with. For example, along the lines of the usefulness of seeing scenarios of how this would have played out in recent years through the droughts. I think would be informative, and also to see more granularity, and in particular in terms of how it impacts the different beneficial uses out there, including irrigation through the summer. And then it's just a little confusing to me. It's almost like this workshop is sort of a progress report, perhaps, because it seems like there are various pieces that are not yet nailed down, such as as mentioned, there's an appendix that's from before that is different from what you're presenting today. And then it was mentioned there will be some kind of an updated report at some point. And then some stakeholders apparently have been met with and others have not. And so it seems like there's quite a lot to sort through. A lot of it looks like a very different approach with some potentially large implications and a lot of uncertainties, frankly, and also some major assumptions that can affect things in large ways. So I guess it's there's a lot that seems unsettled here, and that needs greater detail before any kind of a decision point, I would say. So just wanting to weigh in with those observations.
Thank you, Justin. This is the start of receiving public feedback. This is by no means a final proposal, and as has been mentioned, there may be additional workshops. There definitely will be additional documentation that has to be issued on this, and we're really grateful for folks' feedback, and as we've said, happy to meet directly to discuss meaningful changes that can be made to this, because we are still open to that.
Very good, thank you.
All right, thank you. Just skimming the participants one more time. It looks like we've gotten through all of our speakers. So that will bring us to the end of the public comment period today. If we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to remind everyone again of the written comment period. So written comments related to the workshop topics today are due to Bay-Delta, and those are due 2 weeks from today on Friday, March 24th by 5 p.m. We understand that the content covered today is technical in nature and may raise additional questions, and we're happy to continue today's discussions with any groups that might be interested in doing so. So this slide just has some resources and contact information. So we wanted to remind everyone of the ways that you can stay informed and contact us. Again, you can send an email to us at b-delta@waterboards.ca.gov. We also have a Delta Drought phone line, and that's 916-319-0960. Staff are monitoring the email inbox and the phone line, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. If you haven't done so already, we strongly encourage you to subscribe to the Delta Drought email list to receive important information regarding drought in the Delta watershed. To sign up, visit the Delta Drought webpage and provide your email in the email subscription list box at the bottom of the page. Staff will be updating the Delta Drought webpage as well as the water unavailability methodology webpage with current information, so we encourage folks to check those frequently. And that concludes today's staff workshop. As previously mentioned, the recording of this workshop will be posted on our web pages as soon as possible afterwards, likely early next week. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.